Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the GA Lean Body Podcast, or the Lean Body Podcast for GA players. I'm your host, Brian Keane, strength and conditioning coach and sports nutritionist, here to help you with all things GA related fitness. Today's episode, we are going to keep with the trend, the biggest mistakes GA players make series, and today we're going to talk about food. One of the biggest fall down areas or pitfall areas for GA players from my years of experience working with everyone from underage, male and female, all the way up to intercounty and top level athletes, is the food element and how much people struggle with this side of things. And it's interesting because training, with the exception of probably 3 or 4 things you can do wrong, which I've previously covered in the podcast, last week's episode in particular, the biggest mistakes players make with gym workouts, there's only so much and so many mistakes you can make. With food, it's nearly endless. But what I'm going to do in today's podcast is simplify it down, or at least attempt to simplify it down to the 4 biggest mistakes that players make. And there's a good chance that if you're listening to this episode, you do at least one, if not all 4 of these. These are all mistakes I've made in the past myself, so there's nothing wrong with it in the sense that, you know, don't beat yourself up if you're like, oh, actually, I do that. Just use it as an educational tool, the failure being feedback on what not to do in the future. So that's how I would approach today's podcast. But we're going to talk through some of the more common mistakes players make when it comes to food. The first one is not carb loading correctly. A carb load, for anyone unfamiliar with this, is basically where you increase your level of carbohydrate in the lead up to a game or a big training session to keep yourself fueled. So the analogy I've used in the past is it's like going on a car journey, a long car journey, and filling up your car with petrol or diesel before you go. You want to fuel up your car so that you're able to make the journey. That analogy holds quite true when it comes to games and heavy training sessions or intense training sessions. You need the fuel that's going to help you carb load or help you get through that intensive session. When I was starting off first, I had 2 big mistakes that I made personally. One was I didn't understand what a carb load was, and I didn't understand its importance. This is where a lot of players will fall down, where they'll listen to this show or this podcast and then go, oh my God, I didn't even know what a carb load was. And then they start implementing some of the tools I've talked about in the past and I'm going to talk about now, and they see this huge jump in performance. And it's not surprising. Carbohydrate is literally there as a macronutrient to give you energy. That's its primary focus. There's no essential carbohydrate. There's essential amino acids and essential fatty acids from fat and protein, meaning that your body cannot make it by itself. You have to consume it from food or supplements, but there's no essential carbohydrate. But when you're in a sport, a glycolytic sport or a glycolytic sport, where you're sprinting, you're stopping, you're jogging, you're doing a lot of intensive work in a short bursts, you need to make sure that your carbs, or you're sufficiently fueled with carbohydrate so that you can maximize performance. So the first mistake I made on that side was I didn't know it was even a thing. The second was, and this is so stupid when I think back, but I was of the age, I'm 35 now, and when I was 15, 16, so 20 years ago, when I first started to get really interested in food, nutrition, the gym, training, and I was trying to keep myself in good physical condition. I was trying to get leaner. I was trying to get a 6-pack. I was trying to build muscle, and I was trying to get stronger for football because I was playing a couple of grades above my level. And one of the core myths at that time, which is kind of early 2000s, was that carbs are bad and that carbs make you fat. So if you opened a magazine, which is the 2000s version and equivalent of social media today, you saw influencers, you saw people recommending low carb, so high fat, high protein, which for body composition can work quite well. And for me, it actually worked quite well in that respect. But what happened was 2 things. One, I kept getting sick, meaning that every cold and every flu that seemed to go around, I seemed to get, because my immune system wasn't strong enough to deal with any pathogens or any issues that were going on or anything that was circulating in the school or in college or with my friend circle. So I got sick really often. And the second thing was I felt so tired during sessions. So during that time in my life, 15, 16, I was playing with multiple teams. So I was playing with the underage for Galway, I was playing with my school, I was playing with my club, and I was playing with a couple of age grades above my club. I was playing senior at 15 before the age cap came in. A small rural club, we were playing senior football. And 15, 16 was when I broke into that team. So I was playing with a lot of different teams. And as the season would progress, and as my training load went up, this was before I was even heavy into the gym, I was so tired during games, at the end of games, and in between sessions. Sometimes I could kind of get a bit of momentum and a bit of adrenaline during the game, but in between sessions, I was exhausted. I felt like I could sleep all day, and if I didn't get 12 hours sleep, I didn't feel recovered. And this was down to not having enough carbohydrate for me, because as soon as I reintroduced it several years later, 1920, when I started to get a better grasp of sports nutrition, all those problems went away. I stopped getting sick very regularly, and I found I was recovering well between sessions. So not carb loading correctly is a big mistake players make. How you carb load then really depends on your starting point. General rule of thumb is 4 to 7 grams per kilogram of body weight, but this can increase depending on your starting point, depending on how carb sensitive you are, depending on how much muscle you have and your metabolic rate. There's so many factors, but a general best practice is at 4 to 7 grams per kilogram of body weight. So that's what you'll be consuming in terms of carbohydrates. So that'll range all the way from 240 grams up to 560 grams. I can't do the calculations. Mental math isn't my strong suit. I need a calculator to do that. But that'll be your amount of grams per day, depending on your starting point and depending on what you need. Also, your timeline of how long you load will be based on your starting point. Some players can do a 24-hour carb load, and that's loads. I fall into that bracket. I'm quite short. I'm 5'8". I'm 85 kilograms. I can do a 24 to 36-hour carb load, and that's ideal for me. Anything over that, and I don't feel as good. Some people, if you have a player, or if I'm working with a player who's 6'5", 120 kilos, I might carb load them for 3 days to get them peaked ahead of a championship game or ahead of a game that they're trying to peak for. So there's no hard and fast rule. There's just best practices. But that's how you'll do it. Your food choices then, this will be the high end of how long is a piece of string when it comes from high GI carbs, so simple sugars, all the way down to complex whole grains from oats, quinoa, sweet potato, etc. And you need to experiment with it. I generally find that an 80-20 rule works with a lot of players, so that 80% of your carbohydrates are coming from complex carbs that I've mentioned, and then 20% from simple sugars, whether it's dextrose or branch cyclodextrin or maltodextrin if you've got no GI distress or GI issues with that. There's lots of different simple sugars out there. There's just some examples. So that's kind of a best practice that I found works with a lot of players, but you again will have to experiment within that. The next thing then is being too strict or too rigid. With food, it's very easy to take an all or nothing approach, meaning that you go all super clean food or you go all, I'm just going to eat whatever I want. From my experience as a GAA player and from working with so many over the years, GAA players from a professional coaching standpoint, which is where I stand alongside playing, they're the best athletes to work with, meaning that you rarely have to tell a GAA player to do something twice, in my experience anyways. And people that are coming through my program, they tend to be very highly motivated to make a change. They follow the program. That's why you see some of the ridiculous before and afters and testimonies of energy levels and performance on my page and on my website, because they're applying it. As the plan, of course, is working towards that, but if you don't apply it, none of that matters. And GAA players tend to be very good with this. But a mistake that they can make, and I've made this in the past, is being way too rigid and way too strict with my food. Which meant, in my case, and you might be the same, is being super strict for Monday to Friday, or super strict for a month, and then a blowout at the weekend, or a blowout the month later, because you just can't sustain it. And that's what happened to me quite regularly. I would have a Monday to Friday, and I would be chicken, broccoli, and rice when I was in college, Monday to Friday, and then the weekend was for beer, and the weekend was for chocolate and whatever I wanted. And it ended up feeling this one step back, one step forward, one step back, meaning I was in the same place all the way through and never really improved. And that came from being too strict and too rigid. So a good rule here, similar to the complex carbohydrate rule I gave earlier, is an 80-20 approach. And this is what I do with a lot of my players. And again, I don't want to give a one-size-fits-all to something that's quite nuanced, hence why I work with my players. But a good approach here is where you're going somewhat restrictive with not eating whatever you want or drinking whatever you want during the week, and being a bit looser at the weekend, whether that's after a game or the Friday night before a game on Sunday with free meals. So going out, having some beer, if you're not in peak time of the season, having chocolate, having cake, having a takeaway if that's what you want, and then you're back on plan again the next day. So you have your free meal built in. So being too strict and too rigid can lead to dietary adherence issues, even with athletes in GAA. And I had one player who's probably the extreme example of this, but he was one of those that in any other class, and this is what he said when he signed up to the program, he said, because I trained so much, he was a dual player playing hurling and football. He said, if I played and didn't play sport, I would be obese. And when he showed me his nutritional plan, I'm like, yeah, you're right, 100%. He was literally eating 8 to 9 chocolate bars every single day. He was, from his own admission, completely addicted to sugar. And because his output was so high, he kept maintaining where his body fat was high, but it wasn't super high. He was definitely wasn't in the overweight or obese category. He just had a bit of a belly. And when he sent me that, I'm like, okay, we're going to put strategies in place. So I took a little bit of a different approach with him. I'm not going to cover it on here because it was very specific in terms of what we did in terms of reduction, try to balance out his blood sugar levels a little bit, try to make him a little bit more insulin sensitive to make adherence easier. But that approach for him was, and he knew as soon as the season was over, or if he stopped playing both sports, he was going to be in trouble. So don't be too strict, don't be too rigid, but equally probably don't be too loose. It's about experimenting and finding that balance when it comes to food. I think a good plan, complex carbohydrates like I mentioned, healthy fats, avocado, nut butter, olive oil, red meat to a degree, oily fish, your complete protein sources from chicken, fish, red meat again a lot of crossover with meat there, and fruits and vegetables. Once that's 80% of your program, you're going to have that luxury of eating what you want for the other 20% of the time, especially if you're in somewhat of a calorie control plan. I tend to give my athletes their calories so that they can see what they're eating, but I'm not super strict with it. That's the beauty of being an athlete where you're training so intensely with gym workouts, pitch workouts, games. You have a lot more luxury than the general population when it comes to caloric intake because of your output, similar to my client who was eating those 8 or 9 chocolate bars every day. So don't be too rigid, don't be too strict, but also don't be too loose with your nutrition. The next one then is not focusing on whole foods. Again, another mistake that I made. For whatever reason, when I started to educate myself first on nutrition, I seemed to miss this massive foundation pillar of nutrient-dense foods. Meaning that when I was trying to eat to fuel myself for games and for gym workouts, I didn't understand the difference between whole grain, microwavable foods, processed foods, and I just kind of had them all in this bracket of, if a commercial told me they were healthy, I assumed they were healthy, or if somebody said they're healthy, I assumed they were healthy. Special K being the cereal that jumps to mind straight away. I don't even know if Special K is still out, but that back when I was 16, 17, 18 was marketed as this health kick supplement or breakfast cereal. And I was eating those before training sessions, literally eating bowls of Special K before training sessions because I thought it was healthy. And it's not that it's unhealthy, it's just there's way better things you can eat in terms of nutrient density for food that'll work much better for you as a GAA player. And I just had this misconception around what nutrient density meant in foods, and I just assumed if a commercial told me it was healthy, or if somebody else told me it was good. I remember my dad, and this is, I think I've told this story in the past, I'm not sure if I have. I remember my dad swore by grapes for losing weight. That he's like, well, I used to eat grapes when I played football and I'd drop a load of weight. And I thought until probably 19 or 20, until I started to get an understanding of nutrition, I'm not saying grapes are good or bad for fat loss, but just hearing out the whole story, in my brain was like, well, grapes are an amazing fat loss food. That's what worked for Dad. And as I got older, and as I started to question nutrition more, I understood that, yeah, grapes are relatively low calorie but easy to overeat. They're quite high sugar, but isn't a bad thing for GAA players. They can help with recovery. But my dad would go from eating biscuits and cake in the off season to switching to grapes. And the reason they worked so well for fat loss for him was because his calories came way down because he wasn't eating biscuits and cake every single day. He was eating grapes instead. So he was getting those nutrients from the food, but also his calories massively dropped. And I didn't understand that when I heard it first. It was just because my dad said it, I took it at face value. Same way as when you see it on an ad or you see it on social media, sometimes people take things at face value. So I think having a critical thinking or critical eye on that can be useful, but not focusing on whole foods is a mistake a lot of players make. And you could make this argument all the way from supplements, which I'll come on to next, and protein bars to, a piece of chicken. They're different nutrient densities in those foods. Although you might have 20 grams of protein in a chicken, you might have 20 grams of protein in a bar, they're not created equal. The bioavailability, the absorption rate, the other additives to it, they're not created equal in terms of nutrient density. But it's not to demonize other foods. I have players using protein bars, I have players using supplements. They can work in a controlled plan, and they do work in a controlled plan, but whole foods should be the base of your program, meaning that 80% of your nutrition is coming from those whole foods. And small changes that I made when I was in college, I used to always go microwave rice just because I couldn't cook. And then I started to switch to just the same equivalent of basmati rice, but the whole grain version and the normal real version where the fiber hasn't been removed and there's no preservatives or additives to it. And I found that I was eating less of it and I was feeling fuller and I was feeling more energized. And there's small tweaks and small changes that have massive add up in terms of gains over time. So focus on whole foods for 80% of your nutrition and you won't go too wrong. And then the last one is an over-reliance on supplements, especially weight gainers. So this is where I diverge a little bit. I had an over-reliance on supplements initially, but it was an over-reliance on fat-burning supplements. You tend to find that depending on what you're genetically weak at, you'll navigate towards one area of supplementation more than another. So if you really struggle to put on size and you want to be big and strong and jacked, you'll go towards weight gainers, or you'll have a lot of questions on creatine. If you're someone like me who's quite naturally big, I grew up on a farm, I'm quite thick, I'm quite dense, but I really struggle to get body fat low. And I would go towards supplements for fat burners. So when I was playing, I was taking over the counter fat burners. And what would happen with me is those stimulants, those appetite suppressants would mean I wasn't hungry and I had a lot of fake energy. So I wasn't looking at my nutrition. And although my performance would be good because I'd be relatively fit and you're jacking up your central nervous system with stimulants from those fat burners, I would think they were benefiting me. And then I would play well in a game or at a training session, and then I'd be 3 days trying to recover from that because I actually didn't eat that day. I remember telling a story it was in the GAA Leaner Stronger book, the book I wrote on Amazon. It's a self-published book for any young player that wants to just give themselves some basic education for GAA. When I took a supplement, which is off the market now, it was called BSN Atrofex. It was a fat-burning supplement. And I remember I was in college. It was my first year in college. I was 17, just nearly 18, and I was taking Atrofex. And in one day, I went to the gym in the morning. I took an Atrofex pill, so I didn't eat any breakfast. I went to the gym. I then came home from the gym. I had an apple. I went back to the gym for a second session at 5 o'clock. No food in between. And then I went and played soccer for 3 hours on an AstroTurf that night. And I took a second pill at lunchtime. And the whole day, I felt energized. And I woke up the following morning and I felt like somebody had hit me with a digger or a truck. And I felt horrible. And I had done and probably burnt 5,000, 6,000 calories on probably 130 calorie apple for the day. And it took me, I'd say, a week to recover from that because I felt like I was going to get sick. I was so tired. I could barely get out of bed the next day. And that's the potency of some of these supplements. You have to be very, very careful. I also am pretty sure that if that supplement was brought back now, it would have failed a drugs test. I'd say that's probably why it got banned off the market. And you need to be really mindful of the supplements that you take as a GAA player as well, because they're not all and don't all have legal ingredients for GAA players. So be so careful, especially pre-workouts and fat burners. They're the two that you have to keep your eye on. And then the other end of the spectrum is weight gainers. And it's not that weight gainers are a waste in terms of waste of time. They can be a little bit of a waste of money. And with my players who are trying to build up, some will go with weight gainers a serious mass shake or a mass gainer of 5,000. And I normally say if you're somebody who is time poor and money rich, there's a place and a time for those weight gainers, meaning that the ingredients aren't great, a lot of processed crap in there, but you can't prioritize extra food, and that weight gainer gives you that extra 1,000 calories a day, and you have a lot of money, you're working full time, but you're quite time poor, meaning you don't have a lot of free time. Weight gainers have a time and a place there. For everyone who's not in that bracket, I normally recommend you just make them yourself. Get a blender, get 100 grams of oats, get 2 scoops of protein, and throw 3 or 4 tablespoons of natural peanut butter or natural almond butter into a shake, and then maybe put some MCT oil and olive oil into it. That'll give you about 1,000 calories worth of a shake with nutrient-dense foods, a nice balance of protein, fat, and carbohydrate that will work tremendously well as a weight gainer. And it doesn't take up a lot of room in your stomach. A problem hard gainers have, and people who are trying to put on a lot of size, is they don't think about the caloric density of food. And the way that you get your calories up is by consuming food and calories that don't feel like extra food, i.e. high fat food. So for every gram of fat you eat, there's 9 kilocalories. For every gram of protein or carbohydrate, there's only 4 kilocalories. So by eating more dietary fat, you can increase your caloric intake during the day, help your body build itself up without actually having to eat that much more food. Or oils, MCT oil, olive oil, hemp oil, there's 130 calories per spoonful of those. So it's very easy to add them to your meal. You do 4 of those over the space of a day, you've got 500-600 calories, and you haven't eaten any extra food. So that's a nice little way that you can do it as well if that's something you struggle with. So there you have it, the 4 biggest mistakes GAA players make, the food edition. So hopefully that helped. Again, as I mentioned, it is an area that there's so many directions that you can go wrong in. So hopefully this podcast, this episode, and others have helped to bridge that gap a bit. But these are 4 that I see quite regularly, and also 4 for the most part that I made myself. So hopefully it helped. As always, for those of you interested in working with me in my GAA Lean Body program, I'll put that details for the program below in the description. That's all from me from this week's episode. Catch you all next week.